My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we take a terrifying trip to Tinseltown in Dream Factory.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. Dream Factory is a 37-page scenario for Call of Cthulhu, written by John Tynes with illustrations by Dennis Detwiller. It was published in 1998 as part of Mortal Coils, a collection of Call of Cthulhu scenarios. The scenario, set in the fall of 1926, focuses on Alexander Solzhenitsyn, an exiled Russian filmmaker who has joined a Russian castration cult that worships Shub-Niggurath. Alexander uses the magic he learned in the cult to create a film camera that has the power to drain the souls of those it focuses on, as well as a bizarre projector that immerses viewers in a three-dimensional hallucination in which participants are able to interact with props and characters from the film being shown. Upon arriving in Hollywood, he falls in with a truly horrid gang of friends called the Net. Later, a young actress goes missing and the investigators are tasked with finding her. Their investigation will lead them to a confrontation with Alexander and his magic film equipment, among other terrible things.
So the text begins with background material, including the information about Alexander and his gang, the disappearance, which is the subject of the investigation, and a description of what Hollywood was like in the Jazz Age. And this section also contains a quick reference summary of the entire scenario. The bulk of the text is concerned with how the scenario might play out. Importantly, there is no linear path laid out for you. Rather, the text attempts to address each possible investigatory approach the players might take, from interviewing the various NPCs to conducting various types of research. The text also includes a section on events, which are important moments in the narrative the keeper can use as needed, from the murder of the woman who hired the investigators and tasked them with finding the missing actress Laura Angel, to attacks from a truly villainous NPC, Desmond Miles, and the return of Alexander, who is away on the East Coast, for a good portion of the scenario. The scenario is also peppered with handouts such as newspaper clippings and maps. Finally, the scenario details a number of ways that events can be resolved, with notes on the aftermath, and then mechanical things like stat blocks and new spells.
So let's talk about our bona fides here. How have we used this? I've only read it in preparation for this recording.
Right, I recently ran 4 2-hour sessions online of Cthulhu Dark to do this. So I think if you're doing longer sessions, I think it's still 3 sessions if you're doing 3 hours-ish.
Awesome. So things we liked about Dream Factory. I think I just want to share some overall big picture impressions about this Call of Cthulhu mystery. And basically, I absolutely love it. It is so my thing. I don't know how I've gone so long without reading it, to be honest. It has so many thematic touchstones that are just big order winners for me. I love cults. I love Jazz Age Hollywood.
Yep.
And I love the idea of cinema as a dreamscape. I have played with these themes a lot. I have written a number of Lovecraft-esque and Cthulhu Dark scenarios that explore these themes. And so just at the outset, Dream Factory, personally, is just really, really cool.
Yeah, I think I know why you haven't read this before, though, because as far as I can tell, it only ever appeared in Mortal Coils, the anthology. It's not in print anymore. You can't get it in PDF, legitimately. It's not easy to get hold of. And also, this scenario, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, I think, whenever anyone mentions it, people tend to go, oh, that's a great scenario, but it's so hard to run. And I think a lot of people just don't bother. They hear that and they don't go for it. But actually, if you don't mind me segueing into my first thing I like, is I do like the structure of it, right? So because I think it makes it easy to run in a non-linear way. I mentioned that when describing the contents that it covers all the possibilities, but that sounds kind of terrible, right? Blocks of text. But what it is well-organized blocks of text, literally saying things like searching Alexander's house or interviewing Miles Desmond if you catch up with him. So there are all these little chunks where you read it through once, for familiarizing yourself as the keeper. But then in play, you don't need to remember any of that stuff except for who the characters are. You just think, oh, what are they doing now? they're going to the diner to talk to this guy, I'll flip to that section. And that works like really well. And a while back, I wrote a Call of Cthulhu or Trailer Cthulhu scenario, which I think was subconsciously based on this. It was called City of Light. I don't think I've ever published it yet properly. But I split it into sort of 3 books, like old D&D, which was people, places, and events, which I think was subconsciously influenced by having read this back in 1998, right? And I think if you think of that split, even though they're not split that way in the text, if you just keep in your brain, these are people and they know this, these are locations, they have these things in them, and then there's the events for when it feels like something needs to happen. I found that a really practical way to navigate those chunks the way it's laid out.
That's really interesting. When I was reading this, well, first of all, when I looked at it initially, I said, okay, here goes another 30-page A4 double column monster of a scenario that Tom likes. Listeners, Tom always puts forward these length scenarios.
Hey.
I always put forward like
I do try not to, but my trouble is that I got into the weeds on Warhammer for a long time, man. I can't help it.
Well, probably after doing the Enemy Within, everything seems pretty like
that might
slim
be it,
and playable. Yeah. No, but in all seriousness, though, I looked at it and I was like, oh, shit. Like, this is so much stuff. And normally, it's the level of detail that I don't care for in a module. I find it to be tedious. I don't need all this exposition. I don't need all this backstory. I don't need all of this NPC detail. But I did not have that feeling while I was reading Dream Factory. I'm sure part of it's because I just love the themes that the scenario is dealing with. But I really enjoyed reading it. It was actually a fun read. Yeah. And I mean, I devoured it. I kind of just blew right through it. I thought it was great. Importantly, and I think this kind of piggybacks off what you just said, I felt genuinely briefed afterwards. I felt okay, I can 100% run this. Yeah. I can totally run this. And I don't think I may not even need to refer to it again.
I'm sitting here now. I'm pretty confident, especially having run it once with the book. I think I could do it from memory pretty much.
I felt very okay, I understand these NPCs. I understand their motivations. I have enough of the backstory to kind of vibe with the themes and the sorts of places it wants to go in terms of what it wants to explore. And yeah, I can just totally run this now. I felt so ready to go. Some of these older modules, the author is clearly terrified of everything going off the rails, right? They are terrified that you are not going to be able to respond in the right way. If your player does something, you are not going to have the thing you need at hand. I think that that's a very old-fashioned sentiment in adventure design, but you can see it, right? You can see that sort of terror. I kind of got that impression from this too, but the more I sort of sat with it, it felt more okay, we're going to present a Call of Cthulhu scenario that is not linear, that doesn't require you to go to place A, then to place B, and find clue X. Instead, we're going to just let you run it however you want to run it, let your players do whatever you're going to do, and we're going to support that. We're going to back you up on that by going through almost it felt almost literally all the possible things that the investigators could do. No matter where they search, no matter who they talk to, there's a paragraph about it. And I kind of appreciated it in a way. I was okay, they're at least backing up the idea.
Yeah. In the broad strokes, it is comprehensive, yeah. I didn't find anything... Actually, that's not true. For example, our investigators spent quite a lot of time hanging around talking to a Russian pawnbroker they knew. But that's easy. That's just stock investigation NPC 101, isn't it? Or 102, I guess. But even he was standing in for the Orthodox priest that the text suggests you be an expert on forbidden cults of Eastern Europe. So, yeah, everything's pretty well covered. But it's not that specific. The stuff where they went to interact with the head of security at the film studio, that's very brief. It kind of leaves you on your own. But again, that's where it doesn't matter, because we've all seen movies or met people. Mm-hmm. We can all be that pretty pleased with himself, stiff-necked guy in a suit. So yeah, you're right. It is exhaustive enough. My one quibble is actually the backstory at the beginning. I feel like that's a big slab of text talking about Alexander's life in Russia and the Soviet Union. And I don't feel like there's anything wasted there, but maybe that could have done with a couple of subheadings or something.
It's a lot. One thing I will say, there is all this detail, and listeners, we're not joking. It's a huge amount of detail for this fairly simple scenario, if I'm being honest. The actual A to Z of this scenario is feels straightforward to me. Hollywood actress goes missing. There's a cult. I don't know. It didn't feel like particularly complex to me in terms of like just what's actually happening, no. But there's a lot of like possibilities that the text deals with. And so it makes it seem more complex than I think it actually is. There is a lot of detail. However, one thing that I thought was great about the scenario is that little quick summary reference thing in the beginning. It goes through and tells you just the basics. To me, that little summary portion is like the whole module, right? Like that, like if I were writing a modern day version of this, that's all it would be.
For sure. And even if it was back like set mid 20th century, that's all you would need. But a lot of it is that the 20s in Hollywood is not quite, if you want to sort of be doing this silent era, there's a lot of that kind of stuff that, in fact, I remember at one point, I did a quick Google to check how old, what's the name of the choreographer? Is it Ethel Merman? Yeah. How old she was in 1926, because we were like, is she already working at a studio? Let's find out. She was in the theatre then.
Ethel Merman's a Broadway.
Yeah, exactly. So she was, she was around, but not in movies. Yeah, she was still on the East Coast at that time. Anyway, but that's the thing. Like, you find yourself realising, oh, I thought I knew about this, but actually I don't. And I think that's a lot of what the scenario covers, is this sort of business about, and especially remember this came out in 1998 when Google was not widely available or at all. So if you quickly needed to know about how movie projectors worked, if you didn't have someone in your group who knew already, you kind of needed a little thing saying, yeah, you've got to crank it with your hand to speed up or slow down the film, that kind of detail.
Yeah, well, I think that's what's great about it. Do I think I could run the entire mystery just off the quick reference? Yeah, I'm well versed enough in the time period where I think I could get away with it. But I do like that it has have all that extra detail so that if you really want to have like this immersive experience for the players, you can do that. It's presented in a way that is really fun to read. The author is clearly passionate about the subject matter and passionate about Russian film editing and montage and all that stuff, right? And it comes through on the page. It doesn't feel dry. It feels like a dedicated, passionate sort of like treatment of it in this role-playing game scenario form, right? Which I thought was pretty cool. Something that this scenario does that I think is interesting, and I think we might touch on in the expert delve, I'm not quite sure yet. This scenario understands what is scary. I think there is and I specifically mean like what is scary in the tabletop role-playing game context. There is a lot of like quote-unquote scary modules or horror modules out there, but we're just like sort of pretending to be scared. Like there's no one's like genuinely scared when you're running these things. You might be a little like creeped out, but you're never like, But this module, I think, presents things that are kind of scary in a sort of like, in a psychological way, an unnerving way, in a way where if you just sit and think about it for a little bit, it bothers you.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of horror. It's very surreal at times. It's very like Eraserhead at times. It has like moments of sudden violence, like just the sort of like sudden shock of violence, I think, that kind of disrupts things. It has a good understanding of like how to unnerve players. And I felt that way because when I was reading it, I was just imagining like all the good horror scenarios I've run and the things that have really like popped well. And it's just loaded with stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's set up to succeed. And also it has these very different kind of varieties of fear. So if I can kind of cite some examples from our game, there's a bit, we got to, I think it was session 2 or 3, and someone said, well, we haven't done any breaking and entering yet. I guess that's the next step. And so, yeah, they went around to Alexander's house and tried to get in there. And of course, there's this bit, like, they're not professional cat burglars or even investigators. They're bit part actors from a movie studio. And they're broken into a house and they hear someone coming. And that's like, there's this episode of the TV show Luther that I always think about in this. It's this kind of the horror of decision. I always think of this moment, beginning of one episode, so not really a spoiler, where a character is, I think she's alone in her house, possibly after her roommate had just been killed by this guy with a knife, hiding in the airing cupboard, looking through the slats, classic stuff. And it's just this long, agonizing moment where she's trying to decide, do I keep hiding or do I make a break for the door? If I keep hiding for too long, eventually this guy's going to look in the place where I am. But if I leave now, he might see me and chase me. That's the kind of fear we had there, where this Alexander's servants were coming out to find them. And then you have the opposite, which is where you're going into somewhere is dangerous. The whole going into the basement at his cabin, seeing the weird blood-stained concrete block in the woods, and then going down through the trapdoor. And then, of course, finding what is in the basement, which is almost nothing and yet is everything.
Right, yeah.
You know, there's no sacrificial altar there. You know, it's just some weird paintings and a case with a camera in it. Yeah, so that's that sort of real, I'm terrified, I know this place is dangerous and scary, but I have to go in kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
And then, yeah, like you say, there's the weirdness. So seeing Alexander's projector in action, playing a film in the basement, and seeing it come to life around you.
Terrifying. Like, just reading that part of the module, I got chills reading it, because it's the sort of thing that's, so to me, like, I love the theme of like cinema as dreamscape, cinema as like a sort of false reality, because I think it's scary. And this projector scene, basically, listeners, the way it works is you're playing a film on the projector, but the projector wraps you in this 3D hallucination. And so it's like you're in the film.
And it has sound as well, which is a big difference.
Right, exactly, yeah. What makes it scary, though, is the characters that you can interact with the characters in the film, but they don't really know anything beyond what's in the film. Yeah. They behave in an unnerving way. If you turn and look at parts of the scene that aren't in camera, like that wouldn't have been filmed, they appear strange. Like they appear like
I think, or it's just like filled in with the minimum effort, isn't it? Like in Existence by Cronenberg, where everything is plain when you're inside the game.
Right, exactly. Because there's like this part where it could be like, oh, that's cool, I'm suddenly in the film, how cool. It's like a Star Trek holodeck thing or whatever. But it's not, because the way it's presented is the characters in the hallucination behave in a way that's off. The scene, if you look beyond the edges, beyond the boundaries, it's off. And that's what makes it scary. It is very Lynchian, for starters. And also there was a tradition of this sort of surreal horror, even back when, in the time period when these movies were made.
And then that sort of, that also related to Alexander's filmmaking. The fourth one I want to mention, spoiler alert, Laura has been kidnapped and sucked into the film of the movie she was making with Alexander, which is called Unbroken. And there's this bit where, like, you basically, if you arrange to go and watch the films, which I think at some point you're going to do, right? You sit there watching it in a screening room or wherever, and you see the final scene where Laura's character is dying of scarlet fever, I think. And then after it's finished, someone who has seen it before said, that's not the original ending. Originally, it was a scene with everyone crowded round her, like the end of The Wizard of Oz, except she's dying, not getting better. Spoilers for The Wizard of Oz, by the way. And so that's the moment that you realise, this was reshot after she was last seen. And that was the moment, this sort of putting two things together. So I described the ending and what happened, and the players started asking me, so wait, when we look at it, is there anyone else? There's no one else in the shot? No. And they're like, so it could have just been her and whoever's operating the camera. And I said, yes. And then there was just this long silence. And I could see on their faces, they hadn't figured out what happened, because of course at this point they didn't know about they hadn't seen the projector or the camera that made the film. I could see them thinking about all the possibilities that this raised. And I felt that kind of lurch in the stomach as well, because it was genuinely chilling. So, and we'll come to that, I think, that sort of putting two and two together in the expert delve. But yeah, the whole scenario is set up to kind of cause this cross-pollination between the different ways you can bump into things. And as you say, John Tynes knows what's scary at the tabletop, not just in a film.
At the table, that's important.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
A quick note on John's obvious love for Hollywood is that the four characters the three characters that aren't Alexander in the net, a couple of them are interesting because they're sort of obvious fun homages and yet not fun at the same time to famous people. So Oscar Liemler, the animator, is pretty transparently Walt Disney, but a weirdo, or more of a weirdo. And then I think Clara Negri's kind of meant to be Theda Bara, probably.
I thought that,
or sort of, she's the German, a bit of Marlene Dietrich, I guess, as well, maybe.
Marlene Dietrich, yeah.
And Clara Negri, before Alexander ever met her, was already a serial killer. And there's a sort of what looks like a superfluous side plot in the scenario, which is the his and hers murders.
Mm-hmm.
So every few weeks, every so often, Alexander and Clara have been going to San Francisco and murdering a handsome young man. She did 3 by herself, then he joined her, they've done 3 more. And this kind of looks like, what's the point? But what it does is it helps the scenario to avoid a kind of common difficulty in horror or Cthulhu scenarios, which is you've sort of got 2 things that can go wrong. Either you sort of have the mythos is built up as this unbeatable, implacable, inhuman thing that doesn't care about you. But at the end, it's, yay, we beat it, we get sanity points back. Kind of cheapens the whole thing. Or you have your Graham Walmsley purist adventures, where you don't beat it and everyone dies. But if you didn't pitch that correctly at the beginning, that can be a bit of a downer. But what you get here is these murders give you something you can actually get Alexander on, right? It's Al Capone.
Yes.
You can't get Alexander for being a weirdo cult leader who lopped his own genitals off in the Soviet Union and did a kidnapping that you can't prove happened. But you can get him for the mere fact of a few grisly murders in San Francisco. So that gave like each of our sessions this kind of different atmosphere. Session 1 was just your standard detectives, things are a bit creepy, like True Detective, the good early one. And then season 2 was like Mulholland Drive. That was when they saw the end of Unbroken, and it was all getting a bit strange. People were saying weird things. People were doing that weird Manchurian Candidate thing where if you asked them about Unbroken, they'd start waxing lyrical about how wonderful it was, even if they never talked like that normally. Session 3, classic Call of Cthulhu. They saw the weird stuff. They were, drawing pictures of monsters, this kind of thing. But then session 4, they'd kind of solved it in a way, or like they wrapped up the mystery.
Right. Yeah.
But then they could try and do something about it. It's like at the beginning of Lord of Illusions, where they're driving with shotguns in the car. That's definitely not a spoiler because it's the first scene, and I won't tell you what happens. And it's, this idea of, we've got to go and get this guy before he gets someone else. And again, that's still kind of horror because they know how absolutely terrifying Alexander is now, but they still feel they have to gatecrash Clara Negri's Hollywood party to try and like get some evidence, despite knowing they'll probably get killed. And it just works so well.
The scenario has almost like a quasi-episodic vibe to it. Like I kind of got that impression from reading it. That actually connects to a companion adventure of mine, so I'll save that. But yeah, let's go to questions. I just have one. The characters that Alexander hangs out with, they're called the Net. They're these like other cultists. They're very intense. Like you mentioned, one of them's a serial killer. They're all very intense characters. Desmond Miles is particularly intense. I don't think you can run this scenario for just any group, and maybe that's the answer to my question. I'm curious how you handled the level of intensity in this module, because a lot of it is very rapey. A lot of it is quite horrifying, like implications in terms of like murder and kidnapping and different things. Like it's just very intense. Like, was your group cool? Were you just kind of going all in on that? Or what?
It sort of varied. In session 3, my 6-year-old son was in the same room as me, so I did a lot of talking around topics or using long words that he didn't understand. On my headphones, though, so it was pretty safe. But yeah, you're right. They did meet Miles once, but they didn't really pay too much attention to him as a lead. So they didn't have that kind of... There's quite a few suggested encounters where, if you're tracking him or deliberately interacting with him, you might find him doing his weird murder sprees with the film characters at the cabin, which would be horrific, by the way. So they didn't get that on-screen stuff. But you're right, like, all of those crime scenes are appalling, even when it's just like some LAPD detective trying to skirt around the issue. Like, you're right, you want to put a content warning on it. There's always that thing of, it's a mystery, so you don't want to say what happens. I think you could just like give a sort of compare it to a movie that's similar, like,
It's like Seven or one of those other films that were popular when this was written.
Well, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, it's probably Seven level of gore, isn't it? I guess. Yeah,
I would say so. Gore and like just sort of.
It's not even the gore. It's
just intense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a lot. Yeah. Some of these characters are a lot, and so I think I just don't think you could run this with any group, or you have to at least be very like. This is a kind of pick your players sort of scenario to me. Like, I don't know how you just like put this on the table for like a random thing, like I'm not sure how you do that. Unless you, again, set expectations really appropriately, have all your safety tools.
Yeah, I absolutely would not do this at an open table. Let's put it that way. So
no, it is not an open table scenario at all. Did you have any questions?
This one's a question, but I think it's really an observation, which is, would this be easier to navigate if it had more small illustrations in it? Because there is... the art's pretty good. It's got some portraits of Alexander and his friends, his servants looking weird and creepy, a couple of maps. But I found that it doesn't really have anything that you can hold up to the players, except for the picture of sort of the god summoning film.
Yeah.
And say, this is what you see. It doesn't... like we talk about using illustrations as bookmarks. So you're flipping through the pages and you remember... this was next to that picture of a frog or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
I think it would be better if it was like that. I don't know, man. it's a bit of a victim of its own format, being in an anthology. So, like, if it was a book by itself, it would probably have more space, and like things would be split up in with layout, making it easier to navigate. As it is, it's good, but it's not perfectly user-friendly, I would say.
Yeah, and I think I agree. Let's go to the Chain Lightning round. Of the Skoptsky, which is the cult Alexander's a part of, quote, they were in disarray. Their inability to procreate meant they could only gain successive generations of followers through conversion, and conversion to a castration cult had little appeal to the Russian peasantry.
One of Laura's ex-boyfriends, Nathan Armbruster, is a real slimeball whom your players will detest so much they may be tempted to frame him for her disappearance just because. He is a real piece of work.
I am quite fond of this synopsis of the film Black Mass, which is one of Alexander's films. In this loose adaptation of J.K. Heisman's novel Là-Bas, or Là-Bas, I suppose, a repressed Paris academic falls in love with a mysterious society woman who slowly draws him into the satanic underworld of Paris. Shadowy meetings with strange, decadent fringe dwellers spark the academic's curiosity, but before he knows it, he has become a participant in bloody rituals to the devil. Driven by obsessive love and liberated by this strange underworld, he finally feels at home until a visit by his sister, a kindly nun, rekindles his conscience. He leads the Paris police on a daring midnight raid against the Satanists and bests the devil himself in a strange game of riddles. I want to watch this movie.
I think there is an actual movie adaptation of that novel, so you can. Diner owner Rupert, yes, who was a boxing champion while in prison, is very protective of Laura, and I quote, he writes down his phone number, his diner's phone number, his address, the diner's address, and emphatically tells the investigators to call him anytime, day or night, if Laura's in a jam and there's somebody that needs some hurting.
One of the scenario's newspaper headlines about a young seaman found murdered is Sailor Ashore for Good.
So from the aftermath, regardless of the particular outcome of your sessions, one result remains unchanged. Unbroken is a flop. On October the 6th, The Jazz Singer opens on Broadway. Although not the first sound film, it's the first sound film to use sound to tell a story, rather than for simple novelty. This is the sound equivalent of the Great Train Robbery. The film becomes a smash success during the next several months, and Unbroken plays briefly where it plays at all. Although those who see it find it a powerful film, the power of sound proves mightier than Alexander's sorcery.
Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. Listeners, today we are talking about designing scenarios or modifying scenarios for emergent horror. Tom, why don't you go ahead and define what you mean by emergent horror?
Yes, I've been struggling with the notes for this for several days, but here is my working hypothesis. Because, it's something that I've observed in games and I've been trying to figure out how do you make it work. So let's say it's founded on moments of horrified insight where the player and sometimes the GM puts together two disparate pieces of information for themselves, suddenly seeing new terrible possibilities of like what has happened or is happening, or they suddenly actually see the exact horrific truth. So for a fantasy example, instead of, there are skeletons rushing at you from the dark, you have maybe earlier you heard clicking noises echoing through the tunnels, like hard-soled footsteps. And now you're in a catacomb full of skeletons, but 3 of them are empty. And that's a moment where, the GM doesn't say, so the skeletons are walking around, by the way. No, you just sort of, maybe you figure that out, or you imagine that. But if not, then you just keep moving. The result of this kind of approach, where you don't have fixed points, you go to room A and learn this fact. At time B, you will learn this. What that means is that each player arrives at the kind of their own personal horror moment at different times and probably composed of different materials in the sort of the shared imagination. So like in that long pause I was talking about in Dream Factory, I'm pretty sure we were all imagining slightly different things had happened to Laura Angel. I was, because I knew. So it's a bit like the Stockhausen piece Contactor, where there's a long descending note, and as the frequency lowers, it switches from being a musical note to being just a rhythm. But because everybody's ears are physically different, each listener will have that transformation happen at a different point. The reason we want this sort of individualized experience is because, in my experience, haven't proven this with data, it's scarier, okay? There are creepy moments in the scenario where they're sort of presented by a scene. So, like, if you watch the appearance of the Great Mother in one of the films, but not with the magic projector, we had Xander R., sort of paparazzo photographer guy, who was drawing on the wall where the image had been projected, trying to fill in the gaps that were out of frame. Or when the first time that someone used the projector, we're all going, whoa, this is scary. But to a degree, you could tell we were just sort of playing at being scared.
Right.
But that unbroken screening, that was genuine feeling. And you could really, you could feel it amongst us, even though we were in like 3 different countries playing over Hangouts. So, I mean, I don't know. What do you think about that as a definition? Actually, maybe emergent is wrong, but I think it's the best I could come up with.
I like it. We have talked about presenting horror at the table before. This is a topic I'm fond of. I've talked about it in other places too, not just here. And what we tended to focus on in those conversations was when you are sort of embodying the horror at the table, when you're presenting the horror to the table, you do so, per our recommendation, you do so without a lot of extra affect in order for players to let their imaginations fill in the scary parts. You just say the scary thing, or you just, maybe you make small modulations to your voice or small changes to the way you sort of inhabit at the table, but the players kind of do the rest. This feels like a similar idea, but more content focused, like more substance focused as opposed to like presentation focused or performance focused. You're right. Yeah. So it's this idea of what sorts of elements do you introduce? When do you introduce them? How do you introduce them in order to create a sense of horror that is perhaps different for everyone at the table, but everyone kind of has their own sense of it and kind of fills in the gaps to make it scary to themselves. I think they're 2 very, very closely linked ideas, but I like where you're going with this. I am, if you'll indulge me talking about my game for a minute. Yeah. I have done this in Brindlewood Bay.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Brindlewood Bay is on the surface, and indeed for 75% of the time, about old women solving murder mysteries a la Murder, She Wrote. But it is occasionally interrupted or punctured, or the record stops, right, with these little moments of weirdness. And they're frequently very small moments of weirdness. A strange purple goo, a tattoo that appears to wink at you, maybe just like a heavy fog settling on the area or whatever. And those moments always pop at the table. And I think the reason why they do is because they interrupt the scene, or they interrupt the vibe or the tone. They sort of just assert themselves. And importantly, there's not a huge amount of explanation for what they are, right? Like, why did this creepy thing happen? We have no idea at the table, but it happened. And it's that absence of explanation. It's that suddenness of it that I think makes it scary. Like, I think that's what makes it like genuinely, at least creepy, and a little unsettling, right? So I think we have a couple of linked ideas. This idea of presentationally, which we've talked about in other episodes, have little affect, just say the thing. And content-wise, what we're saying today, this emergent horror idea, it's more about like, say the thing, but without the context, or without explaining much.
Yeah. And you're right, actually. This does pertain to Russian montage, of course, because it's this idea of placing an element next to another element and altering the meaning. And you've reminded me just now that actually the author of Dream Factory, John Tynes, I don't remember where he wrote this. It may have just been in, I think it was so long ago, it could have been in a Usenet group, but talking about the idea of making, I think he was talking about the ghost stories of M.R. James, the idea that they're scary because they are an incomplete system. So it's not just like a thing shows up and it's completely wacky and out of nowhere, but you want to have this sort of idea that, if you knew just one more thing, maybe you'd have the answer. But because you don't, your mind is trying to fill that gap, and there are lots of things that could fit there, and probably none of them are that great. I think that's the feeling. And actually that brings me on to, if we want to do this on purpose, how do we construct it? And I think something that's very important and lifted from Graham Walmsley's Dark Depths structure is having a final horror, which I think is still in Cthulhu Dark, right?
I believe that's still the case, yeah.
There has to be an actual thing or things going on that is bad and scary. What's interesting about Dream Factory is there's no monsters in it. There's a film recording that you could end up watching by mistake of an outer god. But basically it's just horrible people doing nasty things. A girl has been kidnapped and trapped somewhere. That's awful. That's the horror. That's all you need. But everything springs from that. Okay, there's no trail of clues. You have to forswear the idea of clues, in fact, and have evidence. So, whenever the PCs talk to someone, consider what they would know and just share it with the players, or hide it from them and give them the chance to notice that they're hiding it. And crucially, never play out the conversations where they don't learn anything. Just say, this guy doesn't know anything.
I do the same thing. I'm like, you've learned everything you can learn here.
Although sometimes, and actually in Dream Factory it did happen, I would say, oh yeah, he doesn't know anything else. And then a player goes, oh, but wouldn't he be able to confirm the time of something? Or wouldn't he know this? And I'll go, oh yeah, okay, yeah, so he tells you this or that.
Yeah.
Although having said that, when preparing an exception to the no clues rule is, if you think of something evocative that pops into your mind, much like the spooky omens in Brindlewood Bay, write that down and have it in the scene or that location, or associate it with that person. And the best thing about that is, because it's probably going to be some free association nonsense, it will have weird dream logic, which is often good in horror. So that's sort of what I think are the basic building blocks. And then, and this is where it sort of gets weird, is I started thinking about emergent properties of dungeons. You remember when we talked about Winter's Daughter?
Yes.
There's a sort of strand that goes through it of things that change physical properties of the characters, like they end up floating or they get shrunk.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I know that this is part of a design thing. I think Carl Chenier wrote something about it as well. The idea that you do it on purpose because it changes the ways that the players have access to the dungeon, right? They're too big to go through a door suddenly, or they're big enough to reach up to the ceiling if they've been made giant. And you want to do that with your evidence towards the horror. That's why Call of Cthulhu mysteries always have loads of handouts, newspaper clippings, a telegram, a matchbox that you're supposed to fold out and make yourself, and so on. And of course, talking to people, watching films, all this kind of stuff. Because they're all different media, they take that leap of connecting them to create the moments of realization. And you can also do that with changing the PC's characteristics. So like in a dungeon, you might get shrunk to an inch tall. But in horror, you can have physical transformations, which can be body horror, or changes in perception. So like maybe you go to a creepy house, you look around a bit, there are some scratches on the wall, maybe it's a pattern, you're not really sure. So you leave. Elsewhere, it's possible to gain second sight by enchanting an amulet, and then when you come back, you've changed your ability to interact with the evidence, you can see the ghosts. And this is how you create emergent properties as well, because these are the kind of things where if you don't leave a trail of clues, where individual players will come up with ideas for how they can change their ability to access the scenario as a whole. And like status is another thing, although less like directly horror. In Hollywood, in Dream Factory, it makes a difference whether you work for the studio, are you A, B or C list, which in those days were literal lists of actors. Do you have access to a lab? This kind of changes in the way that other people see you. And they all need to be things the players can deliberately alter or accidentally during the screen time. So it's not like I have access to the lab at the start of the scenario or I don't, and that never changes. That's got to be something to be flipped. In fact, imagine if you had access to the lab at first, you somehow lose it, for example, by causing a ruckus and shooting Alexander's magical projector in the studio. Then you get your access taken away. Suddenly you realize I need to get those negatives, but I can't. Now what do I do? That's become interesting and kind of, again, horrifying. Not because not being able to go through a door is horrifying, but because something terrible is happening to Laura and you can't get the thing you need. And that's how you turn those screws, basically.
Well, and I love what you have to say about, like, the PCs having different characteristics, which causes them to interact with the scenario in a different way, and that can lead to horror. I love that, and I think you can even do it in a slightly more meta or gamey way. That's an important part of my personal design. Like, I do think a lot about, like, what is scary at the table, and sometimes that means thinking about the way the game's rules interact with the scenario as well, and how you kind of build it that way. You can do this with something like, if you're just running, like, Call of Cthulhu or something like that, you can just say, like, only characters who have a sanity level of X can see this thing in the scenario. And that creates its own type of horror.
Yeah, for sure. That's interesting. I think that ties into Brindlewood Bay's thing as well of showing them the bad outcome and then letting them get away from it. It's
same idea.
The sort of idea of an alternative reality. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's absolutely the same idea. And just to be clear, listeners, in Brindlewood Bay, your character can literally be killed on screen, but then you have the power as a player to reverse it and have that not happen. But we still all got to kind of share in the horror of watching your character die. We got to have that moment, even though it didn't actually happen in the game. And again, that's a certain type of emergent horror. It's like sort of showing the players glimpses of what could be.
Yeah.
And that has a certain quality to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. And I think, to be honest, all of that is quite easy to cater for when you're making your own scenario. What about if you're using a published adventure? I mean, I think it's kind of a highlighters and notes job. What do you reckon? Especially,
it's a highlighter job. Yeah.
I mean, especially about the sort of different perceptions idea. I'm really into this now. Like, I'm trying to think, what in Dream Factory would I change? What would people be able to see differently?
I think what I would do is I would have it be the projector thing can only happen if thing X has happened already, or if character meets a certain character detail threshold.
In Cthulhu Dark, insight being high enough. Because actually there's a thing in the description, isn't there, which is if you're standing too far away, all you see is the person just kind of moving around, apparently talking to themselves. But if you had like different party members at different levels, you'd have one person chatting away to Lenin. Oh, by the way, listeners, Lenin makes a cameo in this.
Right, yeah. It's an interesting cameo.
It is as well. It's sort of relevant to the backstory, but I don't think our players ever quite figured out what was up because no one spoke Russian. So anyway, but the point is, you'd see one person would be, oh, I'm talking to Lenin. And the other would be, well, what are you doing? Are you okay? What's going on? Yeah, so...
No, it's great. And the way I would do that in play is I would say, if I was running Cthulhu Dark, I was running this scenario in Cthulhu Dark, I would say, like, as soon as they turned on the projector, I would ask, does anybody have Insight 4?
Yeah.
And they'd all look and be like, oh, no one does. And I'd be like, oh, okay, never mind.
That's the classic, yeah.
That's how I do it.
Yeah, you should definitely do that in the open because I think there's a temptation to, I'll split it into different channels and like only show one person one thing. No, don't do that. That's not fun.
No, just totally in the open. Yeah.
Everyone likes to spectate on the weird, creepy stuff because that's the other thing. They can't help. It's like being trapped behind glass while your friend is walking into the scary room. You know, all they could do is watch. It's
just the mere idea that I asked, who has Insight 4? Oh, no one? Okay, well, never mind. And just because it just signals to the players, oh, there's something here.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we can't get it yet. And I have lots of play groups who would probably go back once their insight reached 4 and go mess with the projector, right?
Yeah. And in fiction, you got to justify that as like, oh yeah, we just have a weird feeling we'll understand more now, or something. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. As far as like adapting a module to have more of this feel, I think you're right. I mean, it's really all about highlighting. I think it depends on the system you're playing too. I think that's a big part of it. Like, am I running this in the right system to get the effect that I want? Cthulhu Dark is a great choice because it's so rules light that you get to focus on the parts of a role-playing game that games usually ignore or de-emphasize, like presentation, like how you embody characters, maybe sort of more meta-narrative stuff. And so it just creates a lot of space to do this kind of gaming. And it's a great choice for this idea of picking out things to pepper in to have it be more of an emergent feel, because Cthulhu Dark has the insight roll. So if you see something horrifying, you have to roll insight, and your character might go insane as a result. But what this does in your prep as the GM is you look at the scenario and you start thinking, where are the places that insight could happen? If they see this thing, what's going to trigger the roll? And so what I do is I go through and I use a yellow highlighter and I mark out all the things that I think could cause it. But that has the add-on follow-up effect of being the cool stuff to just drop in where you need it.
In Cthulhu Dark, any roll could also potentially generate insight. Like, you get on a 6, you get a perception beyond the normal, and that's when you have to kind of reach into the other parts of the scenario and give them like some kind of premonition of it, or if there's nothing in that room, then you got to give them something else. And in fact, I remember, speaking of Emergent Horror, we did that. It was Scott, who was playing the photographer, had come up with the amazing investigative idea of figuring out what Laura was wearing when she went missing by looking through all her, as many photos of her as he could find at events, and then see what wasn't in her wardrobe. And so while he was spending all night doing that, he rolled a 6 on, I think it was him, or it was it Rona did it, and he just, like, we needed something creepy, and he just suggested there's this photo of her and Alex, and there's just something about it that's weird. And I was like, yeah, maybe a smudge or something. Yeah, and he said, like, there's like a smudge on it that might be a shadow. And you just look at it. And then we just kind of talked about that for a while in the group. I started to feel creeped out in a kind of David Lynch way, because thinking about this creepy photo with a weird shadow and just the context made it emergently a bit scary. And that all adds up. It sounds like nothing individually, but gradually all this stuff adds up into proper emotions.
Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. I really like this. Listeners, I hope you were able to keep up with it, because I feel like we were going like in a lot of different places. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I think I've talked their ears off enough already.
Indeed. Let's go to the next segment. It's companion adventures. I have mostly a number of films, but then a couple of game things as well. So where would you like to start, Tom?
Well, I've got a bunch of film things. Let's start with films. Okay. What do you want to go with? I
think that you can't go wrong with exploring or looking at anything related to Georges Méliès, the pioneering French filmmaker from the 1920s. 2011 was a great year for Georges Méliès stuff. There was the movie Hugo, which is actually pretty good. It's kind of a lighter movie, but it's good. And there was a documentary that same year, probably connected to Hugo, called The Extraordinary Voyage, which is about Méliès's famous voyage to the moon, which is that famous...
The one with the rocket in the moon's eye, yeah.
The rocket going into the moon's eye, yeah, that's what that's from, right? I love this because, like, one gets the impression that Alexander, the filmmaker in Dream Factory, is a sort of Georges Méliès type character, right? Like, you get that kind of impression from reading it.
For the sort of the Soviet filmmaking side of it, I also got the impression he's a bit like V.I. Podovkin. The V isn't for Vladimir. What is it? Vasev. I'm not going to get it. V.I. Podovkin. So I recommend looking up his 1926 film, Mother. You can find it on YouTube. Links in the show notes. Similarly, I also think a touchstone for his Soviet era works before Hollywood would be Zemlya, Earth, which is 1930 by the Ukrainian director Alexander Dovzhenko. There are some of the synopses that are given are about his sort of quite individualistic films about farmers and unrequited love and stuff. And these are two films in the early Soviet canon that are kind of concerned with those themes. And I think to me, when I was imagining his films, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, that's great. I think you can't go wrong with some surrealist filmmaking from the period that the module takes place in. That's many different films, but I'll go with the kind of big one that people are more likely to know and have access to, which is Un Chien Andalou by Buñuel. I don't know how to describe it. It's very hard to describe. Maybe it's not worth describing.
Did you see me reflexively rub my eye just then?
I did. Yeah. Oh, God. I did see that. I'm not going to say anything else, listeners, but everyone should watch Un Chien Andalou at one point in their lives. So let this be your excuse. Also, to kind of go ahead in time a little bit, I think David Lynch's Eraserhead, as well as the French film, or I think it's French. Is it French? No, it's not French. Repulsion.
British, I think.
One of my favorite actresses. Is it French? Yeah. I know Roman Polanski made it.
But I thought it was shot in London. Oh, I don't know.
I can't remember now. It features a fabulous, my favorite actress of all time, French actress Catherine Deneuve. Yeah. So, but anyway, surreal horror films that I think if Alexander, the filmmaker in the module, was kind of made it to the 60s and 70s, he would have made movies like this.
Sure. Away from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, though, when I asked the players, hey, I'm doing a podcast, do you have any comments? They raised good feedback, which I've already incorporated, but also Josh raised an interesting point. He said, well, I'll just quote him. I did feel like I constantly wanted to move the setting forward to the 40s, the classic detective film period. Mm-hmm. But as I understand it, there were 20s, presumably, silent detective films as well. I'd advise players to watch one before playing. That's true. We kept sort of doing this thing where we'd laughingly kind of refer to a cliche and then think, oh no, that's like 30 years later.
My brain always went to noir as well.
Yeah. So it's actually not that easy to find 1920s detective films. There are a few, but you can watch The Canary Murder Case, 1929, on YouTube, starring Louise Brooks, but interestingly not starring her voice because it was filmed silent. Then they converted it to being a talkie, and she refused to return from Europe to do the dubbing, so they got someone else, and she gained a reputation for being a diva. But that's worth... Yeah, I didn't watch the whole thing. I was a bit busy yesterday, but the detective scenes I was looking at, they do feel different, and you can sort of recognise them being halfway between the hard-boiled gumshoe and the sort of Victorian Sherlocky fusty detective. So yeah, interesting, worth a look.
Any other film stuff you have?
Well, I've got a music... Yeah, let me do music before we do games.
Do your music, yeah, do it.
So aside from being a metaphor for RPG design, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's Contact is pretty good weird science/horror music. It's lots of blips and bloops and oscillating things. So yeah, Contact work number 12 and a half. And again, just Google it. You can find a recording.
Fantastic. Let's go to game stuff because we have several game things here on the list. I'm going to start with a game called Kaleidoscope. Listeners, you're probably aware of a game called Microscope, which is sort of history building game. You use index cards to write out various phases of history, and then you kind of build this big history, which is presumably the preamble for your bigger campaign fantasy game or whatever. But what Kaleidoscope does is it uses the same basic mechanics, but instead of creating the history of a place, you are creating your own foreign art house film.
Oh, I think I remember you guys talking about this on the Gauntlet main podcast ages ago.
Probably 100 years ago, yeah. But you create your own foreign art house film, and the whole kind of premise of the game is you are people who are trying to remember the film, you all just watched it, and you're trying to remember what it is about and trying to decide what it was about. And it surprisingly ends up with you end up creating these films. You just discuss them, right? But in your imagination, you create them. You end up creating these imaginary films that actually feel pretty believably foreign art house films. So I don't know, it's a lot of fun. It's a really, really fun game. I recommend checking it out. It's called Kaleidoscope.
All right, yeah, my game recommendation is the Hollywoodland series pitch, as it's called, written by Jason Morningstar, which is in the Hillfolk core book. So it's a drama system game, and so it's about interpersonal relationships, but it's set in 1914, the very early boom period of Hollywood, and it has a few suggested characters given token shrift who are fictional, and then immediately moves on to, but why not play these characters instead, such as Charlie Chaplin, the corrupt police chief whose name I forget but was real, Lillian Gish, D.W. Griffith, or to be honest, I don't think I'd want to play D.W. Griffith. Fatty Arbuckle, again, not sure about wanting to play him, but yeah. So it's, set in about 12 years earlier than Dream Factory, in the sort of Wild West time of Hollywood.
My last game recommendation is in the Lovecraftian game Lovecraft-esque by Becky Annis and Josh Fox. There is an old Hollywood scenario in the book. It was written by myself. I can't remember the name of it, even though I wrote it, which is a little embarrassing. But if you want a different take on a Cthulhu game in this sort of old Hollywood setting, I think it's I remember it being a good scenario. So hopefully it still is. I will say that it's probably a little bit more Sunset Boulevard, a little bit more forward in time than what Dream Factory covers, but still probably pretty good.
Yeah. I was going to say that's shameless marketing, but you forgetting the name of it is a masterstroke, so I'm sure it's...
Yeah, sorry. It was a long time ago. Listeners, that is our show. Fear of the Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. If you would like to support us on Patreon, it's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you to our enfant terrible of editing, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listeners.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Hi, this is Lowell, manager for the Gauntlet Gaming Community. I want to tell you that we have a Gauntlet Community Open Gaming event coming up the weekend of February 25th through the 28th. This is a free online RPG mini-con aimed at getting new players acclimated to online play, showing off awesome story, OSR, and indie games, and also introducing folks to how we run games on the Gauntlet. Signups will open February 1st at noon Eastern. Even if an event's filled, we have wait lists, and signing up for those is a good way to show game facilitators what RPGs are in demand. You can find all the details and links at gauntlet-rpg.com/gauntlet-community-open-gaming. There you'll find a link to the online registration calendar. Most sessions run 3 to 4 hours, and we have scheduled breaks between blocks. We're still adding events as of this recording. All sessions follow our Gauntlet Code of Conduct, which includes the mandatory presentation and use of safety tools by game facilitators. We hope you'll check out this community-created event. It's free, and anyone can play. You don't have to be a Patreon supporter or community member. Thanks so much.